In 1952, inside the sprawling Edmonton factory in North London, the heavy presses that built Britain's most trusted household clocks were quietly shut down. The Enfield Clock Company had manufactured millions of precision brass movements, successfully defending the British mantelpiece from cheap foreign imports and dominating the high street jewelers' catalog. Yet, at the height of their mechanical supremacy, their independent identity was systematically erased, swallowed by the Smiths' corporate empire. Thousands of skilled workers who had dedicated their lives to cutting brass gears and fitting solid wood cases watched as the Enfield name was wiped from the dials. A workshop system that taught a nation to trust domestic manufacturing was hollowed out to make way for cheaper electric and eventually disposable quartz alternatives. These clocks were built to outlast their owners, and many still sit on repair benches today, ticking flawlessly. The paradox is that Enfield did not collapse because its clocks stopped working. It disappeared because the modern British sitting room stopped needing the mechanical rhythm it produced. Every week, we tell the stories of British clocks, watches, forgotten workshops, and the high street jewelers that once taught the country how to live with time and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with a silent factory, but with a defiant vision of domestic independence in Edmonton, North London, in 1932. In the early 1930s, the British sitting room was undergoing a quiet crisis of identity. The nation that had mapped the oceans with marine chronometers and built the towering public clocks of the Industrial Revolution had lost control of its own mantelpieces. If a family walked into a high street jeweler in 1930 to buy an affordable striking clock for their home, they were almost certainly going to carry out a piece of foreign engineering. German factories in the Black Forest and American mass production empires had flooded British catalogs with cheap, reliable, mass-produced timepieces. The British clockmaking industry, deeply rooted in the traditional workshop systems of Clerkenwell and the high-end craftsmanship of individual makers, struggled to compete on price. They were building heirlooms for the wealthy, while the working and middle classes were buying imported time. This was not merely an economic problem, it was a matter of domestic culture. The clock on the mantelpiece was the absolute heartbeat of the British home. It regulated when the household woke, when the tea was poured, when meals were served, and when children went to school. To rely on imported movements meant that the rhythm of British domestic life was being outsourced. The market desperately needed a clock that possessed the reliability of a German import, the affordability of an American case, and the honest, repairable craftsmanship of a British workshop. That answer materialized in 1932 in the industrial landscape of Edmonton, North London. A syndicate of horological businessmen, observing the sheer volume of wealth leaving the country for foreign clockmakers, recognized that the only way to defeat the imports was to adopt their industrial methods while elevating the structural quality. They established the Enfield Clock Company. Their vision was not to build custom regulators for observatories or delicate carriage clocks for the elite. Their mission was singular and aggressive, to mass-produce the definitive British mantel clock. To achieve this scale, the Edmonton factory was equipped with heavy presses, precision lathes, and assembly lines designed to churn out standardized brass movements by the thousands. They focused intensely on the 8-day striking and chiming movement. A mainspring, a coiled strip of metal that stores energy when wound with a key, meant a family could keep time in a sitting room that did not yet have reliable electricity. A gear train, a series of brass wheels that transfers power from the spring to the hands, had to be cut with enough precision to keep accurate time, but with enough tolerance to be manufactured rapidly. Enfield did not invent the mainspring or the gear train, but they systemized them for the British high street. The physical presence of the Enfield factory in Edmonton shifted the geography of British timekeeping. Hundreds of local workers were hired, trained not as master clockmakers who built a timepiece from start to finish, but as specialists on a modern production line. Some operated the presses that stamped out the heavy brass plates. Others cut the steel pivots or assembled the chiming barrels. This division of labor drastically reduced the cost of production. When the first Enfield striking clocks entered the wholesale market, they were a revelation. Records suggest they were priced competitively enough to sit alongside German models in the catalogs, yet they felt distinctly British. The cases were often solid oak or walnut, featuring the heavy, robust architectural styles that suited the aesthetics of the interwar British sitting room. The true breakthrough, however, was in the high street jeweler's shop. A high street jeweler did not just sell clocks, they serviced them. They were the local guardians of time. If a jeweler sold a cheap, flimsy imported clock that failed within a year, the family would bring it back to the repair bench, and the jeweler's personal reputation in the town would suffer. Enfield movements were designed with the repairer in mind. The brass plates were thick. The components were standardized. If a mainspring snapped, a replacement could be ordered directly from North London and fitted easily. A bushing, a small repair insert used to tighten worn pivot holes in a clock plate, could be installed by any competent repairer because the Enfield movement was structurally sound enough to survive decades of maintenance. The jewelers quickly realized that recommending an Enfield was a safe bet. It protected their relationship with the local families. By the mid-1930s, the Enfield name had established a formidable presence across Britain. They were not just selling clocks, they were selling domestic independence. The familiar tick of an Enfield movement became the soundtrack to evening radio broadcasts and the glowing warmth of the coal fire. A household ritual was cemented. Once a week, usually on a Sunday evening, the head of the family would take the brass winding key, open the glass bezel, and wind the arbors on the dial. One for the time, one for the hourly strike on a coiled gong, and one for the quarter-hour Westminster chime that echoed through the hallway. This was a tactile, physical agreement between the factory in Edmonton and the family in the sitting room. The clock demanded attention, and in return it provided order. As production numbers swelled into the tens of thousands, the Enfield Clock Company proved that mass production did not have to mean disposable quality. They had built a mechanical engine for the British people, completely domestic, highly reliable, and deeply embedded in the retail infrastructure of the country. The Enfield name was finally sitting proudly on British mantelpieces, but the relentless cost of that mass production would soon force them to surrender their independence. The true breakthrough for the Enfield Clock Company did not simply occur because they built a cheaper clock. It happened because they understood that a British mantel clock was not primarily a visual instrument. It was an acoustic one. In the 1930s, before television dictated the focal point of the sitting room, the fireplace was the absolute center of domestic life. The clock that sat above the fire had to provide a reliable, comforting voice. Enfield realized that to truly conquer the high street, they had to mass-produce a striking and chiming mechanism that sounded expensive but cost a fraction of a traditional handmade movement. The engineering answer to this problem emerged from the Edmonton factory floor in the form of their perfected 8-day striking movement. An 8-day movement, a spring-driven mechanism designed to run for just over a week on a single winding, meant that a family only had to remember the clock once a week, cementing the Sunday evening winding ritual into British domestic culture. But the real ingenuity lay in how the clock counted the hours. Many cheap imported clocks relied on a count wheel strike, an older, simpler striking system that could easily fall out of sync with the hands if the owner turned them backwards, resulting in a clock that showed 4 o'clock but struck 6. This meant a frustrating, embarrassing trip to the local jeweler to have the sequence reset. Enfield bypassed this frustration by industrializing the rack and snail strike. A rack and snail, a system using a stepped brass cam attached directly to the hour wheel that mechanically reads the correct time before dropping a lever to count the strikes, meant that a homeowner could move the hands forward or backwards without ever confusing the mechanism. The clock always knew its own time. This single technical decision transformed the relationship between the owner and the object. The clock was no longer a fragile, temperamental machine that had to be handled with fear. It was a robust household engine. They paired this reliable mechanical system with acoustic presence. Enfield manufactured models featuring a coiled gong, a hardened steel wire curled into a spiral that produced a deep, resonant tone when struck by a leather-faced hammer, which meant a small oak case, cases could fill an entire hallway with sound. For their premium lines, they introduced the Westminster chime, a sequence of notes played on a series of tuned metal rods, mimicking the famous clock tower at the Palace of Westminster, meaning the Auditory Authority of London could be purchased and placed on a mantelpiece in a terraced house in Yorkshire. The Edmonton factory was not just pressing brass, they were manufacturing the soundtrack of the British evening. This combination of acoustic quality and mechanical reliability triggered a massive retail breakthrough. By the mid-1930s, Enfield clocks were sweeping through the distribution networks of the country. They appeared in the sprawling catalogs of the great Universal stores, allowing working-class families to order a reliable chiming clock on credit. They filled the display windows of major high-street jewelers like H. Samuel, who required dependable, affordable stock that would not generate customer complaints. They were stocked by Bravingtons in London and countless independent clock shops from Cornwall to the Scottish borders. The Enfield name was aggressively marketed as British-made, a powerful retail advantage at a time when the public was being urged to support domestic industry. But the most crucial endorsement did not come from the catalogs or the shop windows. It came from the back rooms. The British Clock Repair Bench was the ultimate filter for any brand. If a local watchmaker or repairer hated a clock, they would advise their customers against buying it. Many foreign mass-produced clocks of the era used thin brass plates and riveted pillars, making them disposable novelties that were cheaper to replace than to fix. Enfield took the opposite approach. They designed their mass-produced movements like traditional English workshop clocks. The Edmonton movements featured heavy, thick brass plates that were screwed together with threaded pillars, not riveted. This meant a repairer could easily dismantle the clock for cleaning. The gear train, a series of toothed brass wheels that transfers power from the mainspring to the hands, was cut with wide, forgiving tolerances, but anchored by sturdy steel pivots. A pivot, the tiny, polished shaft end of a gear arbor that turns inside the brass movement plate, will eventually wear an oval hole in the brass over decades of ticking. When that happened to an Enfield, the repairer could simply drill out the wear and insert a bushing, a small, fresh brass ring used to restore the pivot hole to its original tight circle. Enfield movements were explicitly designed to be bushed, oiled, and put back on the mantelpiece for another 30 years. The independent high street jeweler realized that selling an Enfield was not a one-off transaction. It was the beginning of a lifelong service relationship with a family. The clock would run flawlessly for a decade, and when it finally stopped, the customer would bring it back to the exact same bench for a routine service. By designing a mass-produced object that respected the traditional repair trade, Enfield secured the absolute loyalty of the British retail system. The Edmonton presses were soon running at full capacity, churning out hundreds of thousands of cases in oak, walnut, and mahogany. The dials, with their clean, legible numerals, became the standard face of British time. The company had achieved what many thought impossible. They had beaten the foreign imports at their own game without sacrificing the repairability that defined British clockmaking. They had proved that Britain could manufacture time on an industrial scale, But that exact scale made them an irresistible target for a much larger empire. By the eve of the Second World War, the Edmonton factory had evolved from a defiant experiment into the undisputed engine room of British domestic time. The sheer physical footprint of the Enfield Clock Company transformed the industrial landscape of North London. This was no longer a quiet workshop of solitary craftsmen hunched over wooden benches. It was a roaring, synchronized manufacturing empire. Heavy presses stamped out thousands of thick brass plates every week, assembly lines. Strictly organized by a modern division of labor, moved incomplete movements from station to station. One row of workers focused entirely on pinning the gear trains, while another calibrated the escapements, the critical mechanism that releases power one beat at a time and creates the signature tick. The air in Edmonton was thick with the smell of machine oil, raw brass dust, and the cut timber of thousands of wooden cases. The distribution of these clocks was absolute. Enfield had successfully infiltrated every major artery of British retail. In the bustling shopping districts of London, highly respected retailers like Bravington's proudly placed Enfield striking clocks in their display windows, signaling to the public that a mass-produced item was now worthy of a premium jeweler's endorsement. Across the industrial North and the Midlands, the sprawling network of H. Samuel, the high street jeweler that practically defined middle-class purchasing power, relied on the Edmonton factory to keep their shelves stocked. For families in remote villages or those managing tight household budgets, the great Universal Stores catalogs offered the clocks on credit. A striking mantle clock, carefully packed in cardboard and straw, would be loaded onto a train at a London railway station and delivered to a local depot, bringing precise mechanical time to a terraced house in Yorkshire or a farmhouse in Wales. The scale of this success did not go unnoticed by the titans of British industry. As early as 1933, the Smiths corporate empire, a behemoth that already dominated the market for automotive instruments and aviation dials, recognized that Enfield had solved the problem of cheap, reliable domestic time. Rather than compete with them, Smiths absorbed them. This was the beginning of a profound corporate consolidation. However, in these golden years, the buyout was not a death sentence. It was an injection of immense capital. The Edmonton factory was vastly expanded. The dials began to carry the dual name Smiths Enfield, a branding marriage that represented the absolute pinnacle of British mass-produced horology. Millions of these clocks flowed out of North London. They were housed in heavy, solid oak and walnut. The most popular was the Napoleon hat case, a curved, sweeping wooden profile that perfectly mirrored the architectural style of the 1930s fireplace. The wooden case was not just decorative. It acted as a vital acoustic amplifier for the internal coiled gong. For more affluent households, Edmonton produced the highly sought-after Westminster chime models. A chime, a musical sequence played on a series of tuned metal rods, brought the auditory authority of the capital into the private home. When a Smiths Enfield clock played the quarters, it was not just making noise, it was enforcing a standard of order. This physical object became the psychological center of the home. In a British sitting room where the glow of the coal fire and the evening broadcast of the BBC radio defined the end of the working day, the heavy resonant strike of a Smiths Enfield mantle clock did not merely announce the hour. It anchored the entire family in a shared, reliable rhythm. Every week, the brass winding key was retrieved from a drawer. The glass bezel was opened. The mainsprings were tensioned. This tactile ritual meant that the owner and the object were in constant physical dialogue. The local repair networks thrived on this predictable system. In the traditional clockmaking district of Clerkenwell, parts suppliers stockpiled Enfield mainsprings and replacement bushes. High street jewelers employed full-time repairers whose benches were permanently lined with Enfield movements, waiting for their routine decade service. It was a closed, perfectly functioning ecosystem of domestic manufacturing retail trust, and high street maintenance. The British mechanical clock had reached its absolute zenith, but to maintain this staggering volume, the factory would soon have to push the limits of its own machinery. Yet the very scale that made Smiths Enfield a household titan began to create its own quiet pressures. By the mid-1940s, the Edmonton factory was not merely a production site. It was a sprawling, complex industrial village. To maintain the volume required by the catalogs and the high street jewelers, the internal organization had to be ruthlessly efficient. This was no longer just about building a clock. It was about mastering the flow of thousands of individual components. Every week, the factory consumed tons of brass and steel, turning raw metal into precision gear trains, chiming barrels, and rack and snail striking mechanisms. The division of labor was so granular that workers became specialists in singular, repetitive tasks. One department handled nothing but the milling of the steel pivots, the tiny shaft ends of the gear arbors that turned within the brass plates. Another team focused exclusively on the delicate process of adjusting the escapement, ensuring that the tick was not just audible, but perfectly balanced in its beat. This level of specialization ensured that even as production numbers climbed into the hundreds of thousands, the quality remained remarkably consistent. It was this consistency that allowed the local repairer, sitting at his bench in a quiet town in the Cotswolds or a busy street in Manchester, to open an Enfield movement with the absolute confidence that he knew exactly how it was built, where the oil points were, and how the strike could be regulated. This era represented the absolute zenith of the British domestic clock. The sheer volume of Smiths Enfield clocks meant they were accessible to nearly every social class. They weren't just for the affluent, they were the standard issue heartbeat of the British terraced house. When a newlywed couple set up their first home, a Smiths Enfield mantel clock was frequently among the first significant domestic purchases. It was an object of permanence. It represented the ambition of a generation that had emerged from the shadow of war and was now focused on building orderly, stable, and comfortable lives. The stakes were clear. In the geography of the British sitting room, the mantelpiece was the stage, and the clock was the lead performer. As the chimes rang out across the neighborhood, they created a synchronized, invisible network of sound. Neighbors could hear the quarter hours pass in unison, a subtle, constant reinforcement of public punctuality. This was a form of soft, acoustic social control, binding the street together through shared time. It was a peak in British domestic history that is hard to fully replicate in our modern, digitized world. But this peak was fragile. The reliance on this heavy, mechanical, brass and wood infrastructure meant that the company was locked into a specific way of living. Smiths had built an empire that conquered the domestic mantelpiece, but they had also traded the independence of the winding key for the vulnerability of a changing household culture. They were betting everything on the idea that the British family would always be willing to perform that Sunday evening ritual of winding the arbors. As the factories hummed and the presses stamped out the plates for another million clocks, the subtle forces that would eventually unravel this entire system, changing heating habits, the rise of the radio and television, and the creeping expectation of effortless, maintenance-free time, were already beginning to move. The Edmonton factory was churning out time at an unprecedented rate, but the mechanical clock was about to face a quiet, frictionless enemy. The peak of Smiths Enfield was not merely a height from which to view the industry, it was a precipice. The first small cracks in the empire did not appear through a sudden, catastrophic failure, but through a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion of the retail landscape. By the late 1950s, the British sitting room began to shift. Central heating reduced the reliance on the fireplace as the focal point of the home, and the rising popularity of television and radio demanded that families rearrange their furniture to face a screen, not a mantelpiece. The Smiths Enfield mantel clock, once the anchor of the room, began to feel like a relic of a slower, more deliberate age. This transition was mirrored in the high street jeweler's shop. The relationship between the retailer and the manufacturer started to fray. As the costs of British labor, brass, and timber rose, the profit margins on mechanical mantle clocks tightened. Retailers found it increasingly difficult to justify the shelf space for an Enfield when newer, cheaper, and more convenient appliances began to clamor for attention. The Sunday winding ritual, once a cherished habit, was increasingly viewed by the younger generation as an inconvenient chore. A clock that required manual attention was becoming an outlier in a world that was being conditioned to expect plug-in and forget convenience. The first significant market force to strike was Force 3, the pressure of good enough accuracy. Cheap, battery-operated wall clocks began to arrive on the market. They did not require the complex brass gear trains, the fusee chains, or the skilled regulation that made Enfield movements a triumph of engineering. They were simple, disposable, and they kept time well enough to satisfy a public that was no longer obsessed with the precision of a mechanical chime. The repairable, heavy, brass and wood philosophy of Enfield was suddenly competing against a product that was priced so low it wasn't meant to be serviced, it was meant to be replaced. In the workshops of Clerkenwell and across the high street repair benches, the impact was immediate. The bread and butter of the local repairer had been the routine service of mechanical clocks, the cleaning of the gear train, the rebushing of the pivot holes, and the delicate adjustment of the escapement. When clocks became disposable, the repair bench began to go quiet. A repairer could no longer justify the hours required to service an Enfield movement when a customer could walk next door and buy a new battery-powered clock for the price of an hour's labor. This was not just the death of a product. It was the slow strangulation of a service infrastructure that had supported the clock industry for over a century. The consolidation under Smiths, which had once provided the capital to expand Edmonton, now became a structural vulnerability. As part of a larger corporate entity, the clock division was subjected to the cold calculus of profit margins that ignored the heritage of horology. The dial name, the dialing, once a symbol of domestic reliability, became a casualty of brand dilution. The name Enfield began to shrink on the face of the clocks, eventually being pushed aside entirely by the Smiths brand. This rebranding was a physical manifestation of a shift in priorities. The company was no longer selling the craft of the Edmonton clockmakers, it was selling the Smiths name across a massive, disparate range of goods. The Edmonton factory, once a site of immense pride and industrial precision, found itself struggling to justify its continued existence in an age of shifting industrial economics. The machinery, specifically the heavy presses and the aging tooling used to cut the brass plates, required constant, expensive maintenance. The workforce, skilled in the nuanced art of mechanical horology, was aging, and the younger generation of engineers was being drawn towards the rapidly expanding sectors of electronics and automotive technology. The mechanical clock, the pride of North London, was slowly being sidelined by the very corporate machinery that had once nurtured it. The decline was becoming visible in the catalogs. Where once the Smiths Enfield mantle clock had occupied full, prominent pages, it was now being relegated to the back of the books, crowded out by transistor radios, electric shavers, and a new wave of imported timekeepers that made the heavy oak case look increasingly dated. The clock was still ticking, but the market around it was already beginning to move. Script begin. The Long Decline, 2325 to 3515, Part 2. As the 1960s progressed, the decline of the Smiths Enfield empire accelerated, turning from a gradual cooling into a systemic collapse. The once mighty Edmonton factory, which had symbolized British industrial independence, began to suffer from the cold, hard realities of Force 4, corporate consolidation. Smiths, now a massive conglomerate with interests far beyond horology, began to view the clock division as an inefficient relic. The Edmonton facility, with its aging heavy machinery and its dependence on high-cost skilled labor, was no longer a jewel in the crown, it was a liability. The management began to scale back production, shifting focus toward high-margin electronic components and automotive instruments, leaving the mantle clock to wither on the vine. This retreat was felt acutely on the high street. For the British family, the Enfield clock had been a reliable, if slightly old-fashioned fixture of the sitting room. But as the decade turned, the retail environment shifted under the influence of Force 3, the arrival of cheap, imported quartz movements. These battery-powered devices, movements regulated by a vibrating quartz crystal, made accuracy cheap, frictionless, and utterly devoid of any need for a human touch. They required no winding key, they needed no oil, they didn't need a repairer. When they stopped, you threw them in the bin. The British consumer, increasingly accustomed to the buy now, replace later retail logic, began to see the solid brass movement mantle clock as an obstacle rather than an asset. The repair infrastructure that Enfield had relied upon began to vanish. A high street jeweler in a town like Guildford or Sheffield, facing rising rents and the falling popularity of mechanical servicing, found it impossible to justify the hours required to bush a worn pivot hole. A bushing, in the small brass insert used to tighten a pivot hole in a clock plate, was a symbol of an era that was ending. When the repairers left, the culture of the mechanical clock went with them. Families began to tuck their Enfield mantle clocks into the backs of cupboards, or, more commonly, consigned them to car boot sales and auction rooms. The final descent was marked by a series of quiet, bureaucratic decisions. The Smith's name, which had replaced the Enfield name on the dials, was itself eventually removed from the domestic clock market. The manufacturing lines at Edmonton were silenced. The heavy presses, the precision lathes, and the dedicated teams of assemblers were dispersed. The factory was not simply closed, it was dismantled, its contents auctioned off, its history discarded in favor of more profitable ventures. The machinery that had once defended the British mantle was sold for scrap, or repurposed in other industries entirely divorced from the art of time. It is worth noting that this was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, rhythmic fading, like a long case clock running down after a key has been forgotten. The ticking grew quieter. The chiming grew intermittent. Finally, the pendulum stopped. The last of the Edmonton presses fell silent. The workers walked out of the gates for the final time. The catalogs stopped listing the mantle clocks. The high street jeweler removed the repair sign. The brass movements were sold for their scrap value. The mantelpieces were occupied by plastic, battery-powered imports. The Sunday winding ritual became a memory of a distant decade. The sitting room fell into a permanent, silent rhythm. The final descent was marked by a series of quiet, bureaucratic decisions. The Smith's name, which had replaced the Enfield name on the dials, was itself eventually removed from the domestic clock market. The manufacturing lines at Edmonton were silenced. The heavy presses, the precision lathes, and the dedicated teams of assemblers were dispersed. The factory was not simply closed, it was dismantled, its contents auctioned off, its history discarded in favor of more profitable ventures. The machinery that had once defended the British mantle was sold for scrap, or repurposed in other industries entirely divorced from the art of time. It is worth noting that this was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, rhythmic fading, like a long case clock running down after a key has been forgotten. The ticking grew quieter. The chiming grew intermittent. Finally, the pendulum stopped. The last of the Edmonton presses fell silent. The workers walked out of the gates for the final time. The catalogs stopped listing the mantle clocks. The high street jeweler removed the repair sign. The brass movements were sold for their scrap value. The mantelpieces were occupied by plastic, battery-powered imports. The Sunday winding ritual became a memory of a distant decade. The sitting room fell into a permanent, silent rhythm.